The Johnson family home in Maplewood was a place of constant tension and fear. From the outside, it looked like any other house on the street, but inside, it was a battlefield. Tom Johnson, a tall man with a perpetual scowl, dominated the household with his volatile temper and cruel words. Emily, 14, and Max, 8, lived in a state of constant anxiety. Their days were filled with walking on eggshells, trying to avoid their father's wrath. The house itself seemed to absorb the negativity, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that never quite went away. One evening, as Emily was preparing dinner for Max, the sound of Tom's car pulling into the driveway sent shivers down their spines. The front door slammed open, and Tom stumbled in, reeking of alcohol. Emily quickly ushered Max into the kitchen, hoping to avoid confrontation. "What's this mess?" Tom bellowed, his words slurring. He swept his arm across the coffee table, sending papers and cups crashing to the floor. Max flinched at the noise, shrinking behind his sister. Emily, her heart racing, tried to calm the situation. "Dad, we're just about to have dinner. Would you like some?" Tom's bloodshot eyes fixed on her. "You think you can bribe me with your pathetic cooking?" He lurched forward, grabbing Emily's arm roughly. She winced in pain but stood her ground, determined to protect Max. "Let go of her," Max cried out, his small voice trembling with fear and anger. Tom released Emily, turning his attention to Max. "You want to be a big man, huh?" he sneered, advancing on the boy. Emily quickly stepped between them, pushing Max behind her. "Dad, please." "He's just a kid," Emily pleaded. Tom's face contorted with rage. He shoved Emily aside, causing her to stumble and hit her hip on the kitchen counter. The pain was sharp, but she bit her lip, refusing to show weakness. Max, seeing his sister hurt, ran to her side. Tom watched them, disgust evident on his face. "Pathetic," he spat, before storming out of the room. As the sound of the TV blared from the living room, Emily hugged Max tightly. "It's okay," she whispered, though they both knew it wasn't. This was just another day in their nightmare, with no end in sight. Mrs. Jenkins, a retired teacher living next door to the Johnsons, had long harbored suspicions about the family's situation. On a particularly stormy evening, her concerns were confirmed when she heard the unmistakable sounds of conflict through the thin walls separating their homes. Peering through her rain-streaked window, Mrs. Jenkins witnessed Tom's aggressive behavior towards Emily and Max. Her heart raced as she watched the children cower in fear. Unable to stand by any longer, she reached for her phone with trembling hands and dialed Child Protective Services, CPS. "I need to report a case of child abuse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As she relayed the details to the operator, tears welled up in her eyes. She felt a mix of relief and guilt, relief that help was on the way, and guilt for not acting sooner. 2 days later, on a gray, drizzly afternoon, a CPS team arrived at the Johnson residence. The social workers, led by a compassionate woman named Sarah, approached the house with purpose. They knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the neighborhood. Tom answered, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the officials. "What do you want?" he growled, alcohol on his breath, even in the early afternoon. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm but calm. "Mr. Johnson, we're here to check on the welfare of Emily and Max. We've received reports of concern." Tom's face contorted with anger. "You've got no right. This is my house, my family." As the confrontation escalated, Emily and Max huddled in the living room, a mix of fear and hope in their eyes. Sarah managed to push past Tom, making her way to the children. "Emily, Max, we're here to help you," she said gently. "We're going to take you somewhere safe." Tom lunged forward, but was restrained by another social worker. "You can't take my kids," he shouted, his words slurring. As Emily and Max were led out of the house, they clung to each other. The rain had stopped, and a weak sun was breaking through the clouds. It felt symbolic, a glimmer of hope in their dark world. From her window, Mrs. Jenkins watched the scene unfold. She saw the children being guided into a car, Tom's angry shouts fading as they drove away. Despite the turmoil, she felt a sense of relief. For the first time in years, Emily and Max had a chance at a better life. Emily and Max arrived at the Maplewood Children's Shelter, a modest 2-story building surrounded by well-maintained gardens. As they stepped out of the car, both children looked around warily, unsure of what to expect. Sarah, the social worker who had rescued them, gently guided them inside. "This is where you'll be staying for a while," she explained. "You're safe here." The interior of the shelter was a stark contrast to their former home. The walls were painted in cheerful colors, and the air smelled clean and fresh. Other children milled about, some playing games, others reading or doing homework. A kind-faced woman approached them. "Hello, I'm Mrs. Thompson, the shelter coordinator. Welcome to your temporary home." Emily and Max were shown to their rooms. Emily would share with 2 other girls her age, while Max would be in a room with boys around 8 to 10 years old. For the first time in years, they each had their own bed with clean, soft sheets. At dinner that evening, Emily and Max sat at a large table with other children. The abundance of food surprised them. There were vegetables, meat, and even dessert. Max's eyes widened as he was encouraged to take seconds. As they ate, a boy named Lucas struck up a conversation with Emily. "I've been here for a month," he said. "It's not so bad. The adults actually listen to you here." Emily nodded, still processing her new surroundings. She kept a watchful eye on Max, who was cautiously interacting with his tablemates. Over the next few days, Emily and Max began to adapt to life at the shelter. They attended group therapy sessions where they met other children with similar experiences. Slowly, they started to open up about their life with Tom. Max, always a soccer enthusiast but never allowed to play, was thrilled when he was invited to join the shelter's team. Initially hesitant, he eventually agreed, his face lighting up with genuine excitement for the first time in years. Emily discovered an art therapy class and found solace in expressing her emotions through painting. Her first artwork, a dark and chaotic piece, gradually gave way to brighter, more hopeful creations. As the weeks passed, both Emily and Max began to relax. The constant fear that had been their companion for so long started to fade. They were learning that life could be different, that adults could be kind, that there was enough food, and that they were allowed to be children. The shelter wasn't perfect, and there were difficult days, but for Emily and Max, it was a haven, a place where they could begin to heal and dream of a better future. As weeks turned into months at the Maplewood Children's Shelter, Emily and Max began to embrace their new reality. The constant fear that had shadowed their lives slowly gave way to cautious optimism. Emily's talent for art blossomed under the guidance of Sarah, the social worker who had become her mentor. During art therapy sessions, Emily found herself pouring her emotions onto canvas. Her early pieces, dark and chaotic, gradually evolved into more hopeful creations. Sarah encouraged her to keep a visual diary where Emily sketched daily, processing her feelings through images. "You have a real gift, Emily," Sarah said one day, admiring a particularly expressive piece. "Have you ever thought about pursuing art seriously?" Emily shrugged and used to praise. "I never really had the chance before," she admitted. But the seed of possibility had been planted. Meanwhile, Max threw himself into soccer with unbridled enthusiasm. Coach Rodriguez, a volunteer at the shelter, noticed Max's natural talent and took him under his wing. On a bright Saturday morning, Max's team faced off against another local youth group. As the game reached its climax, Max received a pass, dribbled past 2 defenders, and scored the winning goal. The field erupted in cheers, and Max found himself at the bottom of a celebratory pileup. "Did you see that, Emily?" Max shouted, his face flushed with excitement as he ran to his sister after the game. Emily hugged him tightly, her own smile mirroring his joy. Their progress didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Thompson, the shelter coordinator, often commented on the positive changes she saw in both children. "They're like different kids," she remarked to her staff. "It's amazing what a stable environment can do." One afternoon, they received a surprise visitor. Mrs. Jenkins, their former neighbor who had called CPS, arrived bearing gifts, new art supplies for Emily, and a proper soccer ball for Max. "I've been thinking about you too," Mrs. Jenkins said, her eyes misty. "I'm so glad to see you doing well." As they chatted, Emily and Max realized they were experiencing something new, the feeling of being truly cared for by an adult. Mrs. Jenkins listened attentively to their stories, laughed at their jokes, and showed genuine interest in their lives. Before she left, Mrs. Jenkins hugged them both. "Remember," she said softly, "you deserve all the happiness in the world." That night, as Emily sketched in her diary and Max practiced ball tricks in their shared room, a sense of contentment settled over them. Their new life, while not perfect, was filled with possibilities they had never dared to imagine before. In the wake of his children's removal, Tom Johnson found himself alone in an empty house that echoed with the consequences of his actions. The initial anger that had fueled his outbursts gave way to a hollow emptiness as days turned into weeks. One evening, Tom sat in his worn armchair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his feet. His bloodshot eyes roamed over the family photos on a mantel, images of happier times that now seemed to mock him. As he stared at a picture of himself as a child, memories he'd long suppressed began to surface. Tom's own childhood had been far from idyllic. His father, a stern and often cruel man, had ruled their household with an iron fist. Flashbacks of shouting matches, slammed doors, and the sting of a belt against his skin flooded Tom's mind. He remembered cowering in closets, much like Max had done, trying to escape his father's wrath. "I swore I'd never be like him," Tom muttered to the empty room, his words slurring. Yet here he was, having driven away his own children just as his father had driven him away. The next day, nursing a hangover, Tom ventured outside for the first time in days. He felt the neighbors' eyes on him, their whispers following him down the street. At the local convenience store, the clerk who had once greeted him warmly now averted her gaze, hastening to complete his transaction. As he walked home, Tom spotted a group of children playing in a nearby park. Their laughter carried on the breeze, reminding him of Emily and Max. A lump formed in his throat as he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his own children laugh like that. Back at home, Tom found a letter in his mailbox. It was a notice for a custody hearing. The reality of potentially losing his children forever hit him like a physical blow. He crumpled the paper in his fist, a mix of fear and anger churning in his gut. Tom spent the next few days in a daze, alternating between bouts of self-pity and bursts of determination to change. He made half-hearted attempts to clean the house and even poured out his remaining alcohol. But old habits died hard, and he soon found himself at the local bar, drowning his sorrows. As the date of the hearing approached, Tom's anxiety grew. He knew he needed to present himself as a changed man, but the weight of his past actions hung heavy on him. The reflection in the mirror showed a man he barely recognized, haggard, unkempt, and haunted by the cycles of abuse he had failed to break. As the day of the custody hearing approached, tension built at the Maplewood Children's Shelter. Emily and Max, now more settled into their new environment, found themselves grappling with conflicting emotions about potentially seeing their father again. Emily, sitting on her bed, confided in her roommate. "I'm scared to see him," she admitted, twisting a strand of hair nervously. "But a part of me wants to know if he's changed." Max, overhearing the conversation, chimed in from the doorway. "Do you think he misses us?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. The shelter staff, recognizing the children's anxiety, arranged for additional counseling sessions to help them prepare for the hearing. Sarah, their dedicated social worker, spent extra time with Emily and Max, helping them understand the process and assuring them of their safety. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse loomed large and imposing. Emily and Max, dressed in their best clothes, walked in with Sarah, their hands clasped tightly together. The marble halls echoed with their footsteps as they made their way to the designated courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Tom sat at one table, looking disheveled despite his attempts to clean up. His eyes darted around the room, finally landing on his children. For a moment, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, regret, longing, or perhaps just nervousness. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Tom's lawyer presented him as a father who had made mistakes but was committed to change. Tom himself stood up, his voice hoarse as he addressed the court. "I know I've done wrong," he said, his words rehearsed but shaky. "But they're my kids. I want another chance to be their father." Emily and Max listened, their faces a mix of doubt and confusion. When it was their turn to speak, Emily stood first, her voice stronger than she felt. "We were always afraid at home," she stated simply. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." Max nodded in agreement, adding softly, "I like where we are now. People are nice there." Mrs. Jenkins took the stand next, recounting what she had witnessed over the years. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of the children's life under Tom's care, her words carrying the weight of long-held concern. As the hearing progressed, the tension in the room was palpable. Tom's face grew increasingly desperate as he realized the uphill battle he faced. The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable as he weighed the evidence and testimonies presented before him. As the custody hearing progressed, the atmosphere of the courtroom grew increasingly charged. The judge, a stern-faced man with graying hair, called Emily to the stand. She walked forward, her steps hesitant but her chin held high. "Emily," the judge said gently, "can you tell us about your life with your father?" Emily took a deep breath, her eyes briefly meeting Tom's before she began to speak. It was hard, she said, her voice gaining strength as she continued. We never knew what mood Dad would be in when he came home. Sometimes he'd yell for no reason or break things. Max and I were always scared. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face a mix of shame and defiance. There were times we didn't have enough to eat, Emily continued. I had to take care of Max a lot. We couldn't have friends over because we never knew when Dad might get angry. As Emily spoke, Max listened intently, nodding in agreement. When it was his turn to speak, he approached the stand with trepidation. I don't want to be scared anymore, Max said simply, his young voice carrying across the silent courtroom. I like the shelter. People are nice there, and I can play soccer. Tom, unable to contain himself, stood up abruptly. I'm your father, he exclaimed. I've made mistakes, but I can change. Don't you want to come home? The judge called for order as Emily and Max recoiled at Tom's outburst. Sarah, the social worker, moved closer to the children protectively. Tom's lawyer attempted to salvage the situation, presenting character witnesses who spoke of Tom's recent efforts to attend anger management classes and seek counseling. However, their testimonies seemed weak in comparison to the raw honesty of the children's accounts. As the confrontation reached its peak, Tom made a last desperate plea. I love my kids, he said, his voice breaking. I know I've messed up, but they're all I have. Please, give me another chance. The judge listened impassively, his eyes moving between Tom and his children. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for his decision. Mr. Johnson, the judge finally said, his tone firm, love is not just a feeling. It's a responsibility. Based on the evidence presented, I do not believe you are currently capable of providing a safe and nurturing environment for Emily and Mac. With those words, the judge announced his decision. Custody would remain with the state, and Tom would be required to complete extensive therapy and parenting classes before any visitation could be considered. As the gavel fell, Emily and Max exhaled in unison, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over them. Tom slumped in his chair, the full weight of his actions finally sinking in. In the days following the custody hearing, Tom Johnson's world spiraled into chaos. The finality of the judge's decision hit him like a physical blow, leaving him reeling and desperate. Tom returned to an empty house that seemed to mock him with its silence. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of Emily and Max, a forgotten toy, a school photo, the height marks on the kitchen doorframe. Each sight twisted the knife of loss deeper. Unable to face his new reality, Tom fell back into old habits. He found himself at O'Malley's bar more often than not, drowning his sorrows in cheap whiskey. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, his reputation having preceded him. One night, slumped over the bar, Tom overheard a conversation that sparked a dangerous idea. Two men were discussing ways to overturn court decisions, mentioning loopholes and aggressive legal tactics. The next day, nursing a hangover, Tom reached out to an old friend, Mike, who had connections to less than reputable lawyers. I need to get my kids back, Tom insisted, his voice hoarse. Whatever it takes. Mike hesitated, sensing the desperation in Tom's voice. Look, man, maybe you should focus on completing those classes, the judge ordered. Show them you're serious about changing. But Tom was beyond reason. They're my kids, he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. The system can't just take them away. As days passed, Tom's anger festered. He began researching obsessively, looking for any way to challenge the court's decision. He convinced himself that everyone was against him, the judge, the social workers, even his neighbors. Tom's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started driving by the children's shelter, hoping to catch a glimpse of Emily and Max. When he saw them playing in the yard one day, looking happy and carefree, something snapped inside him. That night, fueled by alcohol and rage, Tom made a fateful decision. He couldn't accept that his children were better off without him. In his mind, warped by denial and anger, he began to formulate a plan. As he paced his living room, eyes wild and fists clenched, Tom muttered to himself, if I can't have them, no one will. The seed of a dangerous idea took root, one that would have dire consequences for everyone involved. Little did Tom know, his increasingly volatile behavior had not gone unnoticed. The community, still reeling from the revelations of the custody hearing, watched him with wary eyes, sensing that Tom Johnson was a man on the edge. Tom's descent into obsession reached its breaking point on a gloomy Tuesday evening. Fueled by a toxic mix of alcohol and unchecked rage, he fixated on the person he blamed most for his current situation. Mrs. Jenkins, the neighbor who had reported him to Child Protective Services. Under the cover of darkness, Tom stumbled across his lawn towards Mrs. Jenkins' house. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, scanned the quiet street before he approached her front door. Without hesitation, he began pounding on it furiously. "Jenkins," he bellowed. "Open up. We need to talk." Inside, Mrs. Jenkins froze at the sound of Tom's voice. She quickly dialed 911, her hands shaking as she whispered her address to the operator. The door suddenly splintered under Tom's assault. He burst into the house, his imposing figure looming in the doorway. "You ruined everything," he snarled, advancing on the terrified woman. Mrs. Jenkins, despite her fear, stood her ground. "Tom, you need help," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "What you did to those children was wrong. They're safe now." Her words only enraged Tom further. He lunged forward, knocking over a side table as he grabbed Mrs. Jenkins by the arm. "They're my kids," he shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. "You had no right to interfere." As the confrontation escalated, lights began to flick on in neighboring houses. Tom's shouting had attracted attention, and soon, concerned neighbors were gathering outside, some already on their phones calling the police. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Tom, hearing the approaching police, panicked. He released Mrs. Jenkins and backed away, suddenly realizing the gravity of his actions. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his anger giving way to desperation. "I just wanted my family back." Before Mrs. Jenkins could respond, the police burst through the open door, weapons drawn. "Freeze. Hands where we can see them," an officer commanded. Tom, overwhelmed and defeated, sank to his knees, hands raised in surrender. As he was handcuffed and led away, he caught sight of Mrs. Jenkins watching from her doorway, her expression a mix of pity and relief. The night's events spread quickly through Maplewood. At the children's shelter, Emily and Max were gently informed of their father's actions, a final sad chapter in their tumultuous family history. In the wake of Tom's arrest, Emily and Max found themselves at a crossroads. The news of their father's actions had initially shaken them, bringing back painful memories they'd worked hard to overcome. However, as the dust settled, a new sense of finality washed over them. One afternoon, as they sat in the shelter's garden, Emily turned to her brother. "You know, Max," she said softly, "I think it's time we stop being afraid." Max nodded, his young face serious. "Dad can't hurt us anymore, can he?" "No," Emily replied, hugging him close. "We're safe now, and we deserve to be happy." This conversation marked a turning point for the siblings. With the help of their counselors and the unwavering support of Mrs. Jenkins, who had become a constant presence in their lives, Emily and Max began to truly embrace their new reality. Emily threw herself into her art with renewed vigor. Her paintings, once dark and chaotic, evolved into vibrant expressions of hope and resilience. She even had her first exhibition at a local community center, a proud smile lighting up the room as she explained her work to visitors. Max continued to excel in soccer, his natural talent flourishing under the guidance of supportive coaches. He made new friends on the team, learning the value of trust and teamwork. His laughter, once a rare sound, became a regular fixture on the playing field. As months passed, Mrs. Jenkins took steps to become the children's legal guardian. The process was lengthy, but her determination never wavered. "You two have become family to me," she told them one day, her eyes misty. "I want to give you the home you deserve." The day the guardianship was finalized was one of celebration. Emily, Max, and Mrs. Jenkins stood before a judge, their hands clasped together, as he declared them a legal family unit. As they left the courthouse, stepping into the bright sunshine, Max looked up at Mrs. Jenkins and Emily. "Are we going home now?" he asked, a hint of his old uncertainty creeping into his voice. Emily squeezed his hand. "We are home, Max," she said firmly. "Wherever we're together, that's home." Mrs. Jenkins nodded in agreement, her heart full as she watched the two children she'd grown to love as her own. "That's right," she said, "and our home will always be filled with love and laughter." As they walked towards their future, Emily and Max felt a weight lift from their shoulders. The echo of silence that had once defined their lives had been replaced by the warm hum of hope and possibility. They were no longer victims of their past, but authors of their own story, a story of resilience, love, and the power of second chances.